Welcome to the first of several training modules on building an internal audit program. This module will introduce you to the fundamental elements of robust internal audit programs. We'll also look at how thorough planning and well-defined audit processes can help to maximize the effectiveness of internal audits while ensuring useful, high-quality results. While this training module will refer to some specific R2 requirements, note that it's not intended to be used as a standalone guide. For the official text of all R2 requirements, download the R2 standard from the SERI website. Additional information on internal audits can be found throughout the R2 knowledge base. Internal audits have been a part of management systems for many years. Many people think that an internal audit is nothing more than a rehearsal for a certification body audit, but it's much more than that. An internal audit, which is often conducted by a trained and competent staff member, allows for a planned and structured examination of the documented processes and the associated operations of a facility. This process is used to determine whether the operations are being conducted in accordance with the facility's defined procedures, and whether those procedures align with any predefined criteria, such as the R2 standard. An internal audit is also used to determine whether there's adequate evidence, such as any records of process activities and results, to clearly demonstrate conformance with the applicable requirements. There are three types of internal audits required in the R2 standard. The first is a comprehensive audit of conformance with all the R2 core requirements and any of the applicable process requirements included in the scope of the facility's operations. This R2 audit is covered under Core Requirement 3B and must be conducted at least on an annual basis. The second internal audit is related to legal compliance and is found in Core Requirement 4D3. This audit is specific to the legal and other requirements applicable to each R2 facility. And since legal requirements can vary considerably by jurisdiction, there are three key aspects covered by this audit. It starts with determining whether the facility has clearly identified all requirements applicable to its operations. Next, the compliance audit is used to confirm that the facility has implemented specific measures or controls required to ensure compliance. And finally, the audit assesses whether there's adequate evidence in place that demonstrates compliance with each of the requirements. The legal compliance audit is required to be conducted on a periodic basis, so the facility should maintain a schedule for conducting these audits. The results of compliance audits should determine the frequency of audits. Poor performance should result in more frequent audits, while good performance should extend the length of time between periodic audits. And as part of the scheduling process, the facility should react to compliance issues, findings from authorities, changes in operation, or changes in requirements themselves with a corresponding compliance audit. Perhaps it would not need to be a full audit, but simply an audit to assess the effect of the changes or new events. The third type of internal audit is a data security and sanitization audit, which must be conducted at minimum on an annual basis. The requirement for this audit is found in Core 7C3. As the name suggests, this audit is used to assess both the facility's data security practices as well as its sanitization procedures to confirm that they're effective in protecting data devices and destroying all data. We will cover each of these three audits in more depth and in separate detailed training modules, but for now, we'll look at key components that each of the audit programs should consider. It's also important to note that these audits can be conducted individually, as standalone activities, or at the same time. But since the primary focus of each audit varies considerably, so will the competency requirements for the auditors. We will look at auditor competency and audit scheduling in more detail later in the module. While specific internal audits are required as part of the R2 standard, beyond just satisfying those requirements, internal audits should be viewed as an opportunity to test your facility's programs and procedures to gauge their effectiveness. As you plan your audit, direct the auditors into areas that you want the auditor to test more. For example, online sales or sanitization of smartwatches. Or you could select vendors that you want the auditor to review. Use your internal audit as an opportunity to test areas of potential weakness or vulnerabilities. It will improve your operations, and you'll get your money's worth from the audit. Another important aspect of the internal audit process is that it provides the facility the opportunity to verify that it has adequate evidence to demonstrate conformance with the defined requirements, as well as all the related internal procedures. And this evidence is critical for clearly demonstrating conformance to the certification body auditor and preventing nonconformities, or NCs, from being issued through the R2 audit process. This not only makes the R2 audit process more efficient, but can also reduce the overall audit time by eliminating the need for the certification body to follow up on the correction and closure of issues. There are some other important differences between internal audits and the R2 audits performed by your CB. For an internal audit, your facility is able to select the auditors and the requirements they audit. This is important because internal auditors often have a deep understanding of the activities performed, so as long as they're independent of the processes being audited, not only can they provide valuable insight into how effective the processes are, they can also make recommendations for any potential opportunities for improvement. This is an excellent example of how an internal audit can be used to improve the operations as opposed to just finding nonconformances. For an internal audit, the facility also establishes its own internal audit schedule. This means that rather than performing one single audit each year, the audits can be divided into smaller segments performed throughout the year. This can provide wider coverage of the audits by being able to target and assess more areas of the operations over the longer period of time. It also ensures that audits cover any changes in operations, such as seasonal fluctuations in volume. But probably most importantly, conducting regular audits throughout the year makes the audit process less of a standalone exercise and more of an integrated part of the operations overall. What it comes down to is that when properly planned and conducted, your internal audits can be a lot more than just preparing for your certification body audit. Internal audits are an opportunity to test and evaluate every aspect of your facility's operations. They're also an excellent way to get workers engaged and more comfortable with the audit process. This can reduce the stress and uncertainty that can surround certification body audits. A good way to think about internal audits, and a key point to remember when developing your programs, is that the goal of the internal audit should be to prevent nonconformances as opposed to simply finding them. So with that background, your first question might be, where do we start? To help walk you through the process, we will focus on each of the following key components of an internal audit program. We will start by identifying the purpose and basis of the audit, which will include the scope or extent of the audit, as well as the criteria being audited against. Next, we will look at defining the audit process, including any supporting resources, such as audit reporting forms and audit plans. Then we will look at the requirements for auditors, including processes for selecting and training them, as well as ensuring that they are competent. Then we will look at scheduling and conducting the audit, which will be followed by compiling the audit findings and reporting the results. And lastly, we will take a look at what to do with the audit findings, whether there are nonconformities identified, opportunities for improvement, or just general observations. An important place to start the development of your internal audit program is with a clear understanding of the purpose of the audit, or the objectives you're trying to achieve, so that the program can be structured in a manner best suited to meet your objectives. In defining the purpose, there are several key factors to consider. The first is to determine the criteria of the audit. Every audit will have a set of criteria or requirements that the operations are being assessed against. The audit criteria can often be a standard, like the R2 standard, the EHSMS standard, or the QMS standard. But it can also include other aspects, such as applicable regulatory requirements, or even contractual or other customer requirements. It's also necessary to determine the scope of the audit. This will include which activities or operations will be covered by the audit, as well as if the audit will include any off-site locations, remote, or contracted activities. In some cases, audits may be conducted across an entire organization. Other times, they'll be planned and conducted for specific processes, operations, or locations. Another key factor to consider is whether the purpose of the audit is reasonable, achievable, and in line with the timing and resources available. A thorough assessment takes time. Ensuring the auditor is allotted sufficient time to adequately cover all the criteria and all the activities and locations to be assessed is key to ensuring an effective audit. Understanding the purpose or basis of the audit will help guide the development of an effective audit program, that meets the intended needs. With a good understanding of the purpose of the audit, the next step is to define the audit process, and there can be a lot to consider. Keep in mind that the better defined the process is, the more effective the audit can be. This is in part because the internal audit can be a much more detailed assessment of the operations than other audits that may only include high-level sampling of the processes. The other important factor is that the internal audit can go beyond merely identifying nonconformances and instead can be used to identify the key pieces of evidence, such as process indicators and records, that demonstrate conformance with the requirements. Knowing what evidence clearly demonstrates conformance can be a helpful tool in preparing for and in responding to questions from an auditor. Some key elements to incorporate into your audit process include the following. First, you need to determine the audit methods that will be used and provide the auditor with the necessary access and support to enable the audit. For instance, the auditor will need to conduct visual inspections of the operations, so the program should ensure that the auditor has access to all locations and aspects of the operations. The auditor will also require access to all related process documentation and records for detailed review. And the audit process should also include interviews with workers who have been selected by the auditor. Next, think about the sampling process. That is, how many examples of any one thing should the auditor look at to draw their conclusion? For example, consider how many worker interviews you want the auditor to conduct, and to identify how the interviewees should be selected so that you end up with a representative sample of the workforce. When sampling items or groups of items in an audit, be sure to include uncommon items along with the usual suspects. For example, suggest to your auditor that they include accessories or unusual devices. Also, consider how many records you want the auditor to assess in order to draw their conclusions, and determine whether there are some records that the auditor should spend more time on auditing than others, such as detailed shipping records as opposed to training records. Finally, determine how the auditor will assess and use any previous inspections or audit results to ensure any past issues and nonconformances are reassessed. Consider the timing required for the auditor to cover each of the elements of the audit and all the applicable operations. Ensure the process not only provides the auditor sufficient time to cover all of the activities, but also to cover all aspects of the operations. This will help to ensure that the audit results are reflective of the operations overall, as opposed to any individual areas or departments. Also, think about changes in your operations and how they need to be addressed through the audit process. Determine whether operational changes should be prioritized for assessment at the next planned audit or audited on their own if they're significant enough to warrant a dedicated audit. And in addition to defining how the audit should be conducted, also identify any supporting resources, such as audit reporting forms and audit plans that your auditor may require. Lastly, establish the process and forms for recording the results of the internal audit. The tracking and reporting of these results are key aspects to make the most of the audit. Overall, developing the internal audit process requires a lot of thought and planning, but the benefit of a well-designed and detailed internal audit process is that it can identify potential issues and allow them to be corrected long before they become a problem. While internal auditors are expected to conduct well-planned and detailed audits, one of the ways your facility can help is by providing a defined structure and the necessary resources for the audit. Think back to the purpose of the audit. What audit criteria are being assessed? What is the scope of the audit? And what is the planned timing and duration for the audit? The answers to these questions can provide some helpful insight into the audit resources required. Start with the audit criteria. These are the requirements that the operations are to be assessed against. As an example, the criteria could be the entire R2 standard or just one section of it. What's important is that for each internal audit, the audit criteria are clearly defined. To do that, the criteria can be outlined in an audit reporting form. Remember, to be really effective, the audit process must be much more than a simple yes or no answer on that form. It isn't about simply confirming that a process or procedure is in place, but rather testing the established processes and ensuring they produce the intended results. A good audit reporting form requires more than yes or no answers, so your auditor should be prompted with key questions and aspects to investigate in greater detail. These questions and prompts can be easily incorporated into the audit reporting form to ensure that they are considered by the auditor and the details they record will support the auditor's assessment of each. Since the reporting form is such an important aspect of the audit, facilities are well advised to make it a highly detailed resource because this form will become the auditor's working record for the audit activities. Also, think about how the results of the audit will be tracked and reported internally. You will want to be sure that the audit is not just conducted and then forgotten. There should be ways to track the results over time to identify any longer-term trends that may not be identifiable through individual audits. And of course, internal communication of the audit results, trends, and open issues can be facilitated with standardized forms and reports that are easily understood by workers and the management team. There are other resources to include in the audit program that can assist with the audit planning process. These can include a breakdown of the different facilities, departments, or operations within scope that require an audit, as well as an audit calendar for planning and scheduling of each element to be audited, ensuring all required areas are covered. We will review audit scheduling in more detail later in this module. The next step in the internal audit process is to define the requirements for auditors, including the process for selecting and training them, as well as ensuring that they are competent. To start, internal auditors must be adequately trained in auditing techniques and have experience applying those techniques. They must also be knowledgeable of subject matter in two areas: the processes they are auditing and the criteria they're auditing against. Generally, an auditor's competency can be demonstrated using a combination of three things: formal education, training, and experience. The facility should be able to clearly demonstrate how these aspects are used to determine an auditor's competency. Keep in mind that different types of audits require different auditor knowledge and competencies. In some cases, specialized knowledge, skills, or experience may be required. This means that it's unlikely that you will have one auditor that will conduct all of the different internal audits, so multiple auditors may be required to meet all of the competency needs. Another critical point to note is that the auditor must always be independent of the process being audited. Essentially, what this means is that the auditor cannot audit their own work. This is another good example of how having multiple qualified auditors available would be useful for auditing each other's work. These requirements for competency and independence from the process can prove to be a significant challenge for many facilities when selecting auditors. And this is why some facilities use external consultants to conduct internal audits as opposed to a staff member. Still, whether it's a staff member or a consultant, the auditor requirements for competency and independence apply. Facilities should be sure to select auditors well in advance of any audits, not just to schedule the auditors, but to also ensure that the auditor requirements are met. Remember this phrase as you select an auditor. Your certification body auditor knows this phrase very well and will use these three criteria to ensure that your internal auditor selection process is in conformance with our two requirements: trained, competent, independent. With the audit process defined and the auditor selected, the next step in the process is the scheduling and preparation for the audit. It's essential to work from a schedule as you plan and conduct your internal audits, particularly if the audit is being divided into separate activities, either being conducted at different times or by different auditors. The schedule can help to ensure that the audit covers all of the necessary requirements as well as the entire scope of your operations. The other important aspect of the schedule is to plan the audit activities well in advance of key dates, such as the annual audit by your certification body. Doing this will allow for sufficient time to take the corrective actions necessary to address any issues identified during these internal audits, allowing those items to be closed out prior to the certification body audit. Failure to take the time and properly address the internal nonconformities will result in the open nonconformities being transferred over into your R2 audit. This will cause extra audit time for assessing corrective actions and could result in delays in certification. Determining whether to conduct one large audit that covers all the criteria at once or smaller, more frequent audits of various segments of the criteria really depends on what works best for your facility. One large audit can be seen as a way to get a comprehensive look at the status of conformance at any one time and across the entire organization. However, performing smaller, more frequent audits can make the entire process a standard part of the operations, where workers view the checking and corrective action process as normal operating practice rather than a standalone exercise. If you choose one comprehensive audit, you should do this at a different time of year than your annual certification body audit. This will give you ample time to correct any nonconformances prior to your certification body audit. But if you choose to break up your internal audit into smaller, more frequent audits, this creates a culture of continuous improvement. Another consideration is that multiple smaller audits allow for initiating corrective actions on a regular basis rather than having to correct what could be a long list of nonconformances all at once. So you might consider increasing your audit frequency, especially where systems or processes are new or may not have been subject to extensive testing through the audit process. With the internal audit scheduled, it's time for the auditor or audit team to finalize the audit plan. Among other things, the audit plan will define the overall approach to conducting the audit. Where multiple auditors are involved, the plan will identify the specific areas and elements that each auditor is responsible for assessing. And with multiple auditors, the plan should also identify a lead auditor that has the overall responsibility for coordinating the audit and ensuring that it is conducted in an effective manner to achieve the audit objectives. The plan will also define the general order for the different elements of the audit and the anticipated timing for each element. This can be a very useful tool for informing individuals responsible for key operations when to expect the auditor, so that they can ensure the operations are running and workers are available. A good audit plan should always have some key information, including identifying the date and time of the audit, defining the criteria that will be audited, and outlining the order the audit will be conducted in. This includes both the elements to be audited, but also the general flow of the audit. For instance, when things like a facility tour will be conducted, and when other activities such as records review, interviews, and opening and closing meetings will be held. Of course, don't forget to schedule in break times, as well as times for auditors to review, compare, and compile their audit notes. For the audit to be effective, internal auditors must have the full support of the facility and not be restricted on what the audit covers. The audit should also provide a reasonable amount of time for the auditor to comfortably cover all the operations and elements to be audited. You could also consider unannounced audits to get a true perspective of operating activities and conformance. Facilities clean up and prepare when they know a customer is visiting or an audit is planned. That doesn't give you a real internal look at whether the operations are conforming on a daily basis. It's expected that records are maintained when they occur, not just organized when preparing for a scheduled audit. A detailed audit plan and schedule can be an effective way to set the expectations for the audit and build support for the process. Generally, the auditor will initiate the internal audit in advance of the primary audit activities by conducting a document review. The document review process is used by the auditor to assess the facility's written programs and procedures to determine whether they meet the applicable audit requirements or not. Through this process, the auditor can identify key aspects of the procedures or operations that require further assessment or verification through the other planned audit activities. An important tool used during the document review process is the audit reporting form. Not only does the reporting form help to guide the audit process, but it's also used to record the auditor's observations throughout the entire audit. So, introducing the reporting form during the document review and compiling preliminary audit notes helps the auditor identify and track key indicators that require further assessment later in the process. On the planned audit date, the auditor will begin to carry out the rest of the audit activities in accordance with the audit plan. Generally, the audit will start with a tour of the facility or areas being audited. This helps provide the auditor with a broad understanding of the operations and allows for observation of the procedures identified during the document review phase. The auditor will also take time to further review any relevant documentation and will begin to review process records that demonstrate the actual results of the processes being performed. Records can include everything from employee training records and competency reviews to product testing and data sanitization results, and even records of shipments of equipment or components inbound and outbound from the facility. Another important aspect of the audit process is worker interviews. This can be done during the initial tour of the operations, during records reviews, and even sometimes as part of a follow-up tour to further assess observations made by the auditor through other audit activities. Throughout these assessment processes, the auditor will determine a few key things. First, do the facility's processes and procedures meet the intended requirements? Then, are the processes being performed as defined? And is there adequate evidence to demonstrate conformance? To answer these questions, the auditor will identify and follow what is called audit trails. Audit trails are a series of related inquiries and observations around any function or activity to test the processes and confirm that they have been conducted in conformance with the applicable requirements. An example of an audit trail might be selecting a process device that's destined for reuse and confirming that it was properly processed by reviewing the data sanitization and test records specific to that device. And based on the records generated through those processes, the auditor could then confirm whether the proper cosmetic and functioning product categories were assigned to that particular device. Of course, the auditor would want to sample numerous devices in this manner to get a reasonable level of confidence that the process is working as intended. And where there are issues or nonconformities identified, the auditor would follow those audit trails further to assess potential causes and even the extent of the issue. Another example of an audit trail would be to assess incoming products and determine which focus materials they contain. The auditor would then confirm that the FMs are included in the FM management plan and verify that appropriate processes are in place for their management. The auditor would also review the resulting shipping records to confirm they're available and demonstrate that the FMs were being sent to a properly qualified downstream vendor. And a third example would be for your auditor to pick up the audit trail at the very end. Instead of picking a device off the shelf, pick a record of a sold device that was, for example, categorized as an F5. Then check the testing and data sanitization records to confirm that this categorization was correct. So, an audit trail can be developed through a combination of activities, including visual observations, records reviews, and employee interviews that demonstrate the processes performed or the results from those activities. By following audit trails, auditors are able to look beyond whether the basic documented procedures are in place and instead can assess whether the operations are actually being conducted in conformance with the requirements and verify that the results of the process meet the intended outcomes. Remember, an audit is not a simple check in a box of whether a process or procedure has been developed or not. Instead, the audit needs to be a detailed assessment of the processes to determine if they've been adequately implemented and if sufficient evidence exists to clearly demonstrate conformance with the applicable requirements. As already mentioned, the auditor will use the audit reporting form to record notes and observations throughout the entire audit process. On their own, each observation may not mean much, but by the end of the audit, a skilled auditor will be able to compile those results to find things like significant gaps, common issues, or any trends in the findings. This is an important step in the audit process because it can be the difference between identifying a general list of observations, which may or may not lead to any corrections or changes in process, versus identifying breakdowns in processes that require detailed issue analysis and corrective action planning to ensure they're adequately addressed to prevent recurrence. Of course, any nonconformities identified through the audit must be recorded and addressed using the facility's corrective action process. Other potential issues that are identified should also be tracked, and where necessary, preventive actions should also be implemented to avoid having these issues become a nonconformance in the future. But an internal audit is not just for addressing issues. It can also be used to highlight positive activities and developments that can be recognized by the facility. In some cases, there may be opportunities to be expanded upon and realize efficiencies or improvements in other areas of the operations. So, where these items are identified, it's always good practice to highlight them in the audit report as well. If your internal auditor finds a nonconformance, they should always write that nonconformance using a standardized format that contains 3 pieces of information. They need to describe the nonconformance, quote the specific R2 requirement that is not being met, and cite the evidence or specific observation they used to support their conclusion. This process will help your facility with your corrective action process so that the nonconformance can be closed well in advance of your certification body audit. An internal audit is an excellent opportunity to act on a finding that might not be a nonconformance, but instead is an opportunity for improvement. These might include areas where R2 requirements are being followed, but changing conditions, such as increased number of employees or a different material being processed, might result in delays or a reduction in quality. Your facility can take these OFIs and create preventive actions, which address future conditions or areas where your operations could be better. A preventive action is a roadmap toward better operations in the future, and your internal audit is an opportunity to identify them. Your auditor might also include observations in their audit report. These are conditions that do not need a corrective or preventive action, but are smaller items noted during the audit. As we've mentioned, these observations can include items that are going well, along with those that need minor adjustment. Using your audit findings, whether they be nonconformances, opportunities for improvement, or simply observations, can help your facility on a path toward continuous improvement. Finally, after all this work, the results of the audit can only really be useful if they are reported to the staff and management so that they have an idea of how well they are doing or whether any changes or corrective actions may be required. By incorporating standard templates and notification methods into your audit program, the audit results can be quickly and easily reported in a clear, recognizable manner. Make the most of your internal audit by using the results to learn more about your operations. That includes understanding the common, related, or recurring issues, but to also understand your successes and expand upon those for further opportunities for improvement. Use the experiences from employees who were interviewed to help educate others on what to expect through the audit process. If any gaps or nonconformances are identified through the audit, use the corrective action process to analyze the issue. Record any corrective actions and track their effectiveness to demonstrate they've been adequately addressed. Resolving nonconformances well in advance of your certification body audit will help to avoid the extra time and cost of having your certification body reissue the nonconformance and verify its closure. As we wrap up this overview presentation, let's review some of the key points to help you make the most of your internal audit program. When auditing, remember that an effective audit starts with a detailed audit process and plan. Be sure to always use trained and competent auditors and ensure they have a clear understanding of the scope and objectives of the audit before beginning. Always schedule your internal audits to allow for plenty of time before any certification or other audits. This will help to ensure you have adequate time to address any issues so that they are not transferred over to the next audit. A good auditor recognizes that the process is about more than just checking the boxes. It's about testing the systems and verifying there is clear evidence of conformance. We've covered a lot in this presentation, and we know that this level of detail and process can be very overwhelming for a small operation or a facility new to the R2 standard. Sometimes it's best to get help from an external resource. This could be an experienced consultant, upstream customer, or even another R2 facility. How you divide and conquer will be dependent upon your situation. But understanding the elements of an effective internal audit program are still important, even if you outsource your internal auditing. You need to select competent auditors and ensure their process is effective. If you don't understand the internal audit process, you might be paying an outside resource to perform your audits only to receive limited benefits. You should expect a more thorough review in your internal audit than you may receive in your certification body audit. An effective internal audit, conducted using the process we've described, will go a long way in preventing surprises at your certification body audit. Overall, a robust internal audit program will not only help you to identify and prevent issues before they become nonconformances, but it can also help you to identify the different pieces of evidence that demonstrate conformance to the requirements so that you are prepared for your R2 certification audit. Remember, the overall goal of the internal audit process should be on preventing nonconformances, not simply finding them. More information on developing your internal audit program can be found in the R2 Knowledge Base on the SERI website.